Actually, if you look in Euclid's Elements, you won't find those 6 elements of a proposition either. They're there. They're there in everything Euclid proves in Euclid's Elements geometrically, but they're not stated. They're right below the surface. This was a secret hiding in plain sight, and that's why it hadn't been discovered for over 150 years. You know, Abraham Lincoln, we talk about that first grade education. In his autobiography, he says that's his total formal education. If you add it up, all his formal schooling would add up to 1 year. What Abraham Lincoln did was, when he ended his term in Congress in 1849, and as was mentioned, it wasn't a particularly distinguished term. He may have been somewhat depressed, he may not have been, but one thing for sure, he felt inadequate in the way he made demonstrations. And he went home, he went back to Springfield, determined to reinvent the way he spoke, to learn how to make a demonstration. To do that, he basically threw away everything he already knew and proceeded to study Euclid in a way that's extremely well known. But like a lot of Lincoln literature and Lincoln lore, it's everywhere. Everybody knows about it, but there's no real detail behind it because everybody's repeating the same stories or embellishing the same stories. Now, we live in a time of public discourse that frequently is unfriendly. Turns out, as we know, that's not a new phenomenon. It goes all the way back. We live in a time when truth is frequently presented as lies and lies as truth. Lincoln pierced through all that. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I believe it was Isaac Newton Arnold, a fellow attorney, would say, well, you know, you can arouse the crowd whenever you want. You can make them cheer you whenever you want. Why don't you do that? Douglas, of course, would get far more many cheers during the debates than Lincoln did. But what happened after Lincoln was talking was instead of cheers, there'd be small discussion groups, people reasoning through his logic and his talk. And Lincoln's response, according to what Arnold gave Herndon in oral history, Lincoln's response was, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't want their cheers. I want to convince them. And that's what he set out to do. Lincoln, I'm going to jump around a little in time, but we'll get back to sound bites and we'll get back to logical reasoning. Among the things Lincoln was doing between 1858 and 1860, and shortly before he becomes president, he was doing such mundane things as administering bar exams. And he had administered a bar exam to a young fellow named Jonathan Birch, an oral bar exam. And he questioned Birch. Birch recalls this in an oral history also. He questioned Birch a little bit about a rather mundane contracts question. Then they go on and he tells him a few stories and writes something out. I believe this happened in Bloomington, Illinois. Writes something out and says, well, go give this to Judge Logan. And so ultimately Birch gives it to Logan. Logan opens it up, reads it, and later it turns out Birch saw what it said, and it said, this young fellow is smarter than he appears to be. Examine him if you like, but I recommend he be admitted. And he was admitted. Now, I was a temporary bar examiner for the Iowa Bar for many years. When you practice law, you never know what's going to happen the next day. It was true in Abraham Lincoln's practice, and my practice is kind of small and Midwestern. In fact, that's what sort of sucked me into doing this. It was touring Lincoln's offices and seeing some of what he did and realizing it wasn't that much different than the way law practice in the United States in small Midwestern towns was in the early 1970s when I started. So one day I get a packet of documents served on me like this, and it's a suit in federal court against all 9 Iowa Supreme Court justices, all the bar examiners and all the temporary bar examiners. And it's suing us for $100 million, each of us individually, jointly and severally. I believe it was well, I won't say what state. It was an out-of-state applicant who felt there was a conspiracy to keep them out of the bar. And I can assure you, at least back when I was doing bar exam grading, there was no conspiracy to keep anyone out of the bar, in-state or out-of-state. Iowa was routinely passing 85% on the high side, and well, even 90% on the high side occasionally, and if it got below 85%, that was unusual. But anyway, I take this big, thick packet of papers home, and I show it to my wife, and I said, Esther, I said, if the plaintiff wins, it'll nearly wipe us out. Well, I was dutifully defended by the Iowa Attorney General, and I forget whether it was a motion for summary judgment or a motion to dismiss, but it was dismissed summarily on the basis that, at least the part of it that I was interested in as a temporary bar examiner, was absolute quasi-judicial immunity. Now, only a federal judge could come up with a phrase like that. But that's a good soundbite, and at the next bar exam I wore a pin that said, beware, I have absolute quasi-judicial immunity. I don't think it was much more difficult to get into the Illinois bar at the time Lincoln was doing his examining. But one thing that Lincoln was looking for was more reason. Now, in bar exams today, they're not oral anymore for the most. They're certainly not oral anymore for the most part. They're not even necessarily written anymore. A lot of them are multiple guess, and somehow there's a thought that maybe that makes it more scientific, or more well defined. And reserve that in your mind also, because we'll come back to that. What Lincoln did was he took those 6 elements and he transferred them to speech. He identified them. They were virtually lost in the dustbin of history. And had it not been for the Greek philosopher Proclus, they may have been permanently lost in the dustbin of history. Now, Thomas Jefferson had a copy of Proclus in his library. It was the English translation. And he also had a copy of Euclid's Elements. And it's theoretically possible that Lincoln could have seen those 2 volumes when he was in Congress. But Lincoln clearly had his own copy of Euclid's Elements and clearly was studying it by the candlelight through the night while he was riding the circuits 6 months out of the year between 1849 and 1854. Now, what I'd like to do is bring up the second inaugural, and we'll see how that projects overhead. I always have the fear when I open up a computer, it's not plugged in, or people say, you wrote that column for 10.5 years and you can't turn a computer on. And I see I can't bring the file up. Let's try to. There's more than one way to do this. Okay. There's the Annunciation. Now, we could not find a single Lincoln speech or writing before 1854 that demarcates into the 6 elements. But afterwards, virtually all of his great speeches and writings do, other than what's over my time, Mr. Burlingame's tie, the Emancipation Proclamation. That does not demarcate. But most of his other things, at least the great speeches, do demarcate. And these principles, on the surface, are ridiculously simple, but in reality are subtly deep. Every enunciation, basically in plain language, is why are we here? And it starts out with a given. And the given's usually simple. At this second appearing to take the oath, he doesn't have as much to talk about as he did before. These are all true things that absolutely cannot be disputed. Then there is, within the enunciation, the given and then the sought, which is a high-level statement of what is intended to be proved. So here he says, with high hope for the future, with no prediction in regard to it is ventured. Then, to me, one of the most beautiful parts of the second inaugural is its exposition. The exposition takes what's in the given and adds necessary detail to it. This necessary detail, similarly, is absolutely uncontroversial. There will be nothing in a properly formed exposition that is subject to any reasonable challenge. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously addressed or directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiations. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And to Lincoln, the survival of the nation was a contract. That was just pure legal contract law. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, when the Constitution, everybody signed the Declaration, everybody signed the Constitution. That's a contract. And in order to break it, you've got to have everyone sign off in the other direction, and that obviously wasn't going to happen. Seeking to dissolve it and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. The other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. I mean, that's a summation of, I don't know how you could say it any more succinctly than Lincoln said it. And the war came. I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. There's a well-known national trial lawyer, Pat Malone, whose office, I believe, is just a few blocks from the White House. He's an outstanding lawyer. He wrote an article in 2008 in an American Bar Association publication, Litigation. And he comments on the sentence, "and the war came." And he says, "Note the power achieved by what is left out, by understatement. A lesser speechwriter, even if he had the idea of using war as the subject creating action, not the object being acted upon, might have said something like, 'And the war with all its terrible suffering and needless bloodshed came about despite all our efforts to prevent it.'" Well, yeah, "and the war came" is understatement. But for Abraham Lincoln, that was a real easy sentence to write. Not because he was a great writer, which he was a great writer, but that's not the reason. It's because of the location. This is in the exposition. He's not going to argue in the exposition. He's just going to present facts, because the way a Euclidean demonstration works, you start out with the givens, you move through definitions or facts, you proceed directly through, you proceed to a specification where the proposition being proven is more explicitly stated. Each look for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. That's a little bit more complicated a specification than in much of Lincoln's work, but it's still a specification. It's what he's trying to prove. And then in the construction, What happens in the construction of his speeches, just like in any Euclidean proposition being proved, and this is a really short construction, you reveal the facts that you turned up in your investigation. So these usually are pretty straightforward. They're not as clear-cut as givens, but neither are they argument. Then you get down to the proof, and in the proof, that's where you make your argument. And in his argument in the second inaugural, Lincoln points out that the prayers of both can't fully be answered, and basically states things that are reasonably logical to deduce from the facts he's set up. And then he gets down to his conclusion, and in the conclusion, he's going to restate what he's proved. And he talks about accepting punishment, binding up the nation's wounds, taking care of the injured, and seeking a just peace. Now, this is a true leader. This is what a leader is supposed to do. And he does it through proof. He does it the same way he approached his legal cases when he's practicing law. And I maintain you can't really fully understand Abraham Lincoln without understanding his law practice. And comes to a useful conclusion. You know, when you start practicing law, usually what you're trying to, everybody else is smarter than you. You don't know anything when you start. It was certainly true for Abraham Lincoln, and it was 10 times true for me. And the first thing you start to do is try to figure out how to break the rules. One of the rules in presenting a case, in most courts when you're trying a case, a jury case, you get in front of the jury, you give an opening statement, and you're not supposed to argue. You're just supposed to say the evidence will show, but usually you say it in a little more clever way than that, and you just recite what the facts are going to be in this trial. And I spent a lot of time creatively figuring out how to get around objections so that I could argue in an opening statement. Before, decades later, I realized how stupid that was, and that if you wanted to be effective, you never argued in your opening statement. You saved your argument for closing argument, and that's where you made your case, just like Lincoln did. And one of the discoveries in the book, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the legal process itself is Euclidean. And if you look at the way appellate briefs are constructed today, it's a Euclidean format. Now, appellate briefs were virtually non-existent in Lincoln's time. They used to talk for days. But it's a Euclidean process, and I'm pretty good at doing appellate briefs, and I've always done them. But the hardest part for me over the years in doing an appellate brief is drafting the argument. No matter how thoroughly and properly I researched it, I always had trouble drafting my argument. I'd draft, and I'd redraft, and draft, and redraft. Now I use Lincoln's Euclidean technique to to make my arguments, to write some of my letters, and I don't have any trouble. It falls right into place, just like "And the War Came." I want to get a couple more up here quickly, if I can. Let's take a quick look at the Gettysburg Address. Yeah. All right. The given in the Gettysburg Address, pretty straightforward, fourscore years ago, fathers brought forth on this continent, new nation conceived in liberty. Now there's a civil war, incontrovertible. All right, the sought, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. So what Lincoln's trying to prove here is whether the nation will endure. His exposition, we are met on a great battlefield of war. Specification, we've come to dedicate. Now remember, the specification clarifies what's being sought. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who have here given their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper we should do this. So again, the emphasis that the nation might live. The construction talks about, well, you know, in a larger sense, we can't dedicate it, we can't consecrate it. The brave, the living, the dead, the people who struggled here have consecrated it above what we could. And then says, but the world can never forget what they did here, even if it forgets, even if it little notes it. All right, those are a little more than facts, but they're not argument. They're kind of reasoning. But then you get down to the proof. Yeah, that may take the rest of my speech, but I'll try. Did it move? It didn't move. Okay. You don't believe I wrote that for 10 years, do you? Thank you. I'll do anything to get applause. Okay. So the proof reasons a little bit and argues, to the extent there is argument, resolving that these dead shall not have died in vain, then his conclusion that this nation shall not perish from the earth. Pretty simple, pretty direct. These are elegantly simple principles. I want to get back a little bit to glitz, sound bites, and civility. My co-author, Dan Van Haften, has a bachelor's in mathematics, a master's in mathematics, and a PhD in electrical engineering. Towards the end of last month, he was on Milt Rosenberg's show, Extension 720, a radio show out of WGN in Chicago. And it's a 2-hour show, but it was only an hour this day because the station recognizes what's really important, and there was a hockey game on that night, so Dan got an hour on there. And Milt, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he taught for many years at the University of Chicago, very bright guy. And he runs this, what I would call a down-to-earth radio show. And he wants to play a few excerpts. So he starts playing what he calls an excerpt from the House Divided speech. And the House Divided speech, of course, is the speech that Lincoln gave to the Republican convention when he was running for the Senate. And the speech starts, and it turns out it's a Raymond Massey excerpt from Young Abe Lincoln, or whatever the name of that 1940 movie was. And for those of you who may remember, Raymond Massey had this deep, rich voice, which would have been grossly unlike Lincoln's. And the speech starts out, and there are 2 sentences, and I'm listening in Des Moines on a radio to this broadcast, and Dan's in the studio in Chicago, and it's not the House Divided speech. I knew it 2 sentences in. I mean, I could probably maybe quote 6 sentences from the House Divided speech, but like many Lincoln speeches, it's a magnificently beautiful speech, and it all hangs together, and none of it was making sense. These words were coming out from nowhere, and it's going on and on. You can hear the voice railing. You can almost see the gestures, even though it's over the radio. And I'm going, well, how's Dan going to handle this? Because he's surely going to get a question on the House Divided speech right after that excerpt. So later on, I said to him, Dan, what were you doing when you started listening to that speech? And he said, well, I started turning pages like mad, trying to find out where he was, and I couldn't find it. And finally, towards the end, when Raymond Massey utters a House Divided, then Dan knows where to go and finds it and realizes that it's not the speech. And that shows you the difference between a lawyer and an engineer. I mean, in my gut, I knew it instantly, and he's trying to get it precisely. But Dan and I have known each other since the 1st grade, and we truly were 2 authors co-authoring a book, and it couldn't have been written without both of us. Dan handled that situation very diplomatically. But my purpose in reciting that whole story is that this soundbite orientation, this Hollywoodification of reasoning or attention span, this is not modern, this is not new. The angry discourse, this is not new. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, always was courteous. He could be courteous in a way and gentle in a way and civil in a way that as he was sticking his knife in your back and turning it, you were saying, "Thank you, how wonderful." He knew how to attack someone else's credibility. On the other hand, he did not hit below the belt. He did come forth with reason. He did come forth with logic. And in that sense, he was different from everyone else in the public discourse, and he's different than people are now. One more demarcation I want to get up here. There are a couple more I wanted to, but given my speed at getting them up, I want to get into the Declaration of Independence. Can't be at the National Archives without talking about the Declaration of Independence. Then if we have time, I'll get to Baltimore Sanity Fair. Okay, one day we're sitting around in Des Moines, I don't know, a year or so into the book, and we're looking over a quotation from Judge Wanamaker, who is a Lincoln biographer from about 1918, not particularly well reputed. But he says something, makes some reference to the strange association between Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, and wondering about the similarity of their reasoning. And basically he's talking all over the place, and half of what he says is clearly wrong, but the other half is so close to target. I looked over at Dan and I said, I wonder, you don't think the Declaration of Independence would demarcate, do you? And Dan went up to the computer that was on the dining room table, printed out 2 copies of the Declaration of Independence, and he goes, draws 5 lines, and then marks down a given and a sought, but doesn't show it to me. He hands me the other printed sheet that didn't have any markings on it, and said, "You do it." And I go, mark out a given and a sought, and we'd done it identically. The Declaration of Independence demarcates more clearly, more easily, more directly, and more straightforwardly than any Lincoln speech. Let's just, you all know the Declaration, but it's just so straightforward. Oh, now I figure out how to do this. The given, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve, and it goes on, it requires that we declare the causes that impel them to separation. So the given is the course of human events. The sought is what's going to impel us towards separation. And here's the exposition. We're expanding on the given. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, everybody has called the Declaration of Independence Euclidean. Everybody has. All men are created equal. What could be more Euclidean than that? But again, just like with Lincoln, everybody stopped short. They didn't probe deeply. And so it goes through the exposition, and then the specification. When in the long train of abuses, these facts keep showing up. There's a duty to throw off the government. And then in the construction, what the construction is, well, I just lost my... The construction here is very long, because there were a lot of grievances, as you know, and they're listed. They're listed. Just straightforward list. And then there's the proof, we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace and friends. That's the proof. And then the conclusion, with a firm reliance on the protection of the divine providence, we pledge to each other lives, fortunes, our sacred honor. In other words, the Declaration is just straightforward Euclidean. There's one other Jefferson document that's straightforward Euclidean, but is a little more textured, kind of like some of Lincoln's stuff, and that's the Statute of Virginia on religious freedom. And I encourage you to go look at it. We have it demarcated in the book, but go look at it. What's truly unusual about the Statute of Virginia is Jefferson is straightforward, proving a proposition in Euclidean format, and that proposition is a bill. It's a statute. And who would ever think to draft a statute in the form of a straightforward proposition? He does a beautiful, magnificent job doing it, and I commend it to your reading. You know, there's one more thing about Jefferson. The next logical thing, of course, was to attack Jefferson's speeches. Jefferson supposedly was not a good speech giver, and we found out why. We couldn't find a single Jefferson speech that demarcated in the elements of, 6 elements of Euclidean proposition, not one. So if you wonder why Jefferson wasn't a good speech writer, we've got the answer, and if you wonder why Lincoln was, we've got the answer to that too. Just real briefly, one more point. You know, the work of Lincoln and Jefferson is not done. Now, Euclid was roughly 2,500, 2,300, 2,500 years ago. We have a chapter on Isaac Newton where we talk about how basically Euclid was the father of the scientific method. Newton held Euclid in such high regard, felt things were proven more succinctly, more firmly in a Euclidean format than any other format, that he wrote his Principia in that format, and unfortunately writing it in that format meant that maybe there were 3 or 4 people in the world that could understand it, because he basically had to invent calculus, then put it in a Euclidean format, which it's not well suited to prove that. My point here is that look what the scientific method has done for us in 2,500 years. We go to the moon, we take pictures farther out in space, we build nuclear weapons. We can do all kinds of magical things with the scientific method. Abraham Lincoln took that very same method and transferred its principles into oral presentation. What can we do in the next 2,500 years, or 500 years, or even 50 years, if we take Lincoln's method of human, civil, reasoned discourse to persuade, not to sizzle, not to flash, but to persuade? Maybe then we can make the true dreams of Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson indeed come fully true, and instead of just "and the war came," maybe the peace can come true too. Thank you.
Are you pessimistic because, unlike in the case of Lincoln, when we know he wrote 99% of all the words he uttered in public, or his mind thought those words and then he said them, are you pessimistic about the rise of political speechwriters in the modern era? Does that forever break the link between the mind of the leader and the words spoken to the public? And does that lead to great trouble? Are we at the stage now where we can never go back to the mind and time of Lincoln because the speechwriter now intervenes between leader and public?
Well, you know, obviously we have a presidency now that the president can't do everything him or herself. So there has to be, I mean, Lincoln hardly had secretaries when he went to the White House. On the other hand, I'm not pessimistic in this sense. We have limitless resources that we waste. The greatest of them all is time. And if we channel our energies in the right direction, there's nothing we can't do. And most of what is done is basically in response to what the public wants. So I don't think the responsibility is so much with our leaders, it's with ourselves. And if we start demanding the kind of rigor that Lincoln gave his public, There's no reason we can't have that rigor for us too. But that's my opinion.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation a great deal with its emphasis on reason. And as a lawyer myself, I always envy a lawyer that can branch out. But my question is this. I think by focusing on Euclid, to me, you take a too narrow view of what Lincoln did as far as reason goes, and you miss a lot of the speeches. You mentioned Isaac Newton as using Euclid. I thought of Spinoza, who you may or may not know is
He had a whole
philosophical
system
book
of ethics, yeah.
which is directly out of it. What Lincoln does seems to me more, if I had to use a classical example, would be Aristotle's rhetoric, Aristotle's logic, which uses the syllogism. Something that uses language rather than just figures and numbers, because without that, without the language and Lincoln's power over it, I don't think you quite capture what he's about. And I'm sure he had classical speeches to look at, just like Frederick Douglass did when he was learning how to write.
Actually, Aristotelian speech is what got us into the mess we're in right now. And that's, speech has not evolved much since Aristotle. Euclidean speech is the direct opposite of Aristotle. Aristotelian technique, you use any trick in the book to convince your people, and Stephen Douglas was an expert at Aristotelian speech. But to address your question more directly, the reason this works, and the reason it worked for Lincoln, and the reason it works just intellectually is geometric speech is speech. In other words, even though Euclid was using diagrams to illustrate his problems, when he was proving them with words. He was literally writing sentences. He was giving a speech to prove those theorems. And that's why it translates so wonderfully into speech. And that structure is all invisible. There's no algebra in it. Now, you know, the way geometry is taught today is different. Euclid's gone way out of favor. You know, as far as the book being narrow, we probably could have spent 5,000 pages just talking about Lincoln's Euclidean speech. And you know, if you want a rich, textured view of Lincoln, read Michael Burlingame. But and it's worth every word of reading. We don't pretend to give you a whole answer, and we certainly can't solve the world's problems. But we know this. We found out how he talked, how his speeches mean, and they have a structural meaning that makes them come through. They're not innate genius that's just coming out of words spun from whole fabric. This is a textured forest, and the words are just the leaves.
You noted that to fully understand Lincoln, you need to understand Lincoln as a lawyer. And my question is, what sources of information would you recommend for understanding Lincoln the lawyer?
I think just keep reading books. There have not been very many Lincoln lawyer books. You know, I like Frank's book, but that's written more for a lawyer. But I think the more you read about the way Lincoln practiced law, you get a sense of it. But the other aspect of that is, and this addresses a terrible deficiency in the public in general, law is kind of like restaurants. I mean, everybody, you go into a restaurant, everybody knows what they think is good food, and everybody knows what they think is good law. We need to know more, not just about law in Lincoln's time, because it really wasn't that different than law now. All of us, particularly non-lawyers, need to know more about the way law operates, just as a matter of being a citizen. And certainly, if you want to understand Lincoln, just find out all you can about at least American law. And it doesn't even have to be historically. Historical is good, but today's law, it'll give you insights. It'll help you understand Lincoln better.
Thank you for your presentation. It was certainly formidable and most interesting. I have a question for you related to the problems that Lincoln faced both with his cabinet and with what you might call the non-functional nature of some of the departments of government, perhaps beginning with the War Department, which instead of having a really fleshing out, was on a destructive bent from the days of Jefferson through the days of Buchanan. And Lincoln had to formulate government, if you will, in some of these respects. Did he, in your view, or did you look at whether or not he used a Euclidean format in solving some of the major underlying problems in developing the structure necessary to fight the Civil War and to form a government?
Yeah, I don't know about Euclidean format, but he certainly used what I would call logical legal format, in the sense when he was having his disputes with McClellan, he would send him interrogatories and not get real honest answers back. And I think the way he dealt with people was at least similar to the way he would deal with clients, with judges. I mean, he knew how to deal with people. On the other hand, he was slow to act just by his nature, because he recognized the importance of knowing the facts. In fact, he spoke at Sanity Fair, one of the speeches I wanted to get into, about the purported executions of African American prisoners of war. And one of the ways he kind of put off deciding what to do about it, I think, was to investigate the facts more carefully, and whether it was because he wasn't going to do anything without knowing the full facts, particularly if it involved cross-executions, or whether he was just trying to kick it down the road, I don't know. But it would be very much like him to want to know the facts before doing anything serious. If there is a criticism of Lincoln that I've seen, and I don't know how reliable it is that, and it's kind of been spoken to today, once he made up his mind, he did not change it. Though obviously with the Emancipation Proclamation and slavery, I mean, things changed a little bit. And he was not quick to seek others' advice. But on the other hand, when he knew he had to rely on his military commanders, he at least had discourse with them. But someone else can probably give you a better answer than that. Anything else? Okay, thank you.